They called him an outsider, a warrior, a legend. Tonight, we explore the biography of Yasuke, the Black Samurai. You're listening to Boring Biography, and this is a sleep story designed for deep relaxation and insomnia relief. Settle in, and let's begin. Yasuke arrived in Japan from distant lands and entered history not through conquest, but presence. Serving under Oda Nobunaga, he stood at the crossroads of cultures, faiths, and swords, a quiet figure in an era of constant conflict. Imagine temple bells at dusk, armor resting in stillness, and a lone warrior far from home. Close your eyes, settle in, and let the journey begin. The earliest part of Yasuke's life exists without certainty. There is no birth record bearing his name, no written account of his childhood, and no document that tells us exactly where he first opened his eyes. What we know comes from later descriptions, brief references, and educated historical inference. Most historians believe Yasuke was born somewhere in East Africa, likely in the region that today includes Ethiopia, Mozambique, or Sudan. These conclusions are drawn from physical descriptions recorded by observers in Japan, who noted his height, build, and skin tone, as well as from the trade routes that connected Africa to the wider world during the 16th century. At the time of Yasuke's birth, East Africa was already deeply connected to global commerce. Coastal cities along the Indian Ocean traded gold, ivory, textiles, and people. Ships moved steadily between Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia, carrying merchants, sailors, laborers, and travelers across long distances. Movement across continents was not unusual, even if the individual stories of those who traveled were rarely preserved. Yasuke's early life, whatever its exact location, would have been shaped by a world very different from Japan. Languages, customs, landscapes, and beliefs would have formed his earliest sense of self. None of these details survive in writing. History does not tell us who raised him, what name he was given at birth, or whether he left his homeland willingly or under compulsion. What remains is only the certainty that he came from far away. Before he became visible to Japanese chroniclers, Yasuke lived an ordinary human life beyond the reach of recorded history. He ate, slept, learned, and endured in a world that did not imagine it would one day remember him. The absence of detail does not suggest insignificance. Rather, it reflects how rarely the lives of non-European, non-elite individuals were documented in the 16th century. In this silence, imagination often rushes in. But for now, the record asks us to stay still. Picture a vast coastline under a quiet sky, warm winds moving across the land, the steady rhythm of waves along the shore. Somewhere within that wide, unrecorded world, a man lived whose life would one day intersect with a distant country, briefly illuminated by history before fading again into quiet. For now, Yasuke remains only a presence, a human being before a name, before a title, before the moment when the world begins to write him down. And so we move slowly forward, leaving his origin behind, carried gently by time toward the first recorded crossing that would bring him closer to history's narrow light. At some point in the late 16th century, Yasuke left the world of his birth behind. The details of how this happened are not recorded, but by the time he enters written history, he is already far from Africa, traveling as part of a European entourage. Most historians agree that Yasuke was in the service of the Jesuit missionary Alessandro Valignano, an Italian priest responsible for overseeing Jesuit missions across large parts of Asia. Valignano was known for his insistence that missionaries respect local customs and languages. He traveled frequently, moving between ports and colonies, as he managed religious outposts spread across great distances. Yasuke appears to have accompanied him as a retainer, guard, or servant. The exact role is unclear, and no document describes the nature of their relationship in detail. What is certain is that Yasuke crossed oceans. The journey from Africa to Asia in the 16th century was long and physically demanding. Ships followed established trade routes, stopping at ports along the way for supplies, repairs, and fresh crews. Travel could take months, sometimes longer. Storms were common. Disease spread easily in the close quarters of wooden ships. Many passengers did not survive such voyages. Yasuke did. He would have experienced the steady creaking of the hull, the constant motion of the sea beneath his feet, and the long stretches of time with little to do but wait. Days passed under open sky. Nights arrived with the sound of water against wood. The world narrowed to the rhythm of travel. Along the route, languages changed. Clothing styles shifted. Food tasted unfamiliar. Customs altered from port to port. Each stop brought new faces and new expectations. Yasuke moved through these spaces as an outsider everywhere, African among Europeans, foreign among Asians, belonging fully to none of the worlds he passed through. By the late 1570s, Valignano's mission turned toward Japan, a country newly encountered by Europeans and already deeply curious about the outside world. Jesuits had arrived there decades earlier, bringing firearms, trade opportunities, and Christian teachings. Japan was politically fractured, ruled by competing warlords, yet culturally confident and highly structured. In 1579, Valignano traveled to Japan as part of an inspection tour of the Jesuit missions. Yasuke was with him. As their ship approached the Japanese islands, the landscape would have looked unfamiliar. Steep mountains rising from the sea, densely forested slopes, and coastal towns shaped by local traditions rather than European design. For Yasuke, this was another arrival in a place that did not know him, and where he did not yet know how he would be received. The journey had brought him to the edge of a new chapter, though no one aboard the ship could have known how unusual his presence would soon become. For now, he was simply a traveler who had crossed continents, a man shaped by movement, a figure passing quietly through history's threshold, carried forward by the slow pull of fate and tide. The ship reached shore. When Yasuke first stepped onto Japanese soil, he did not arrive quietly. In the towns and ports where Valignano's entourage traveled, people noticed him almost immediately. Japan in the 16th century was not completely isolated. Traders from China, Korea, and Europe had already arrived. But an African man of Yasuke's stature and appearance was something entirely unfamiliar to most who saw him. Contemporary accounts describe him as exceptionally tall and physically powerful. His dark skin astonished local observers, many of whom had never seen someone like him before. Word spread quickly. Crowds gathered, drawn by curiosity rather than fear. People followed him through the streets. Some stared. Some reached out to touch his skin, reportedly believing at first that its color might be ink or paint. According to Jesuit records, the attention became so intense in certain places that order broke down. Streets clogged. Shops closed. People climbed onto rooftops just to get a better view. For Yasuke, this attention would have been inescapable. He moved through cities where every step drew eyes. Silence followed him, then whispers, then excitement. In a society governed by strict etiquette and visual cues, clothing, posture, rank, he did not fit into any known category. He was not Japanese, not European, not merchant, not monk. He was simply unprecedented. The Jesuits themselves became concerned. Valignano, who valued discipline and order, reportedly worried that Yasuke's presence was distracting from their religious mission. Yet removing him from public view was difficult. Wherever they went, people gathered again. Eventually, word of Yasuke reached the ears of one of the most powerful men in Japan. At this time, Japan was under the rising control of Oda Nobunaga, a warlord known for his ambition, military innovation, and intense curiosity about foreign cultures. Nobunaga welcomed new ideas, new weapons, and new people, especially those who challenged tradition. When he heard reports of a towering foreigner with dark skin who traveled with Christian missionaries, he ordered that the man be brought to him. In 1581, Yasuke was summoned to Azuchi Castle, Nobunaga's grand stronghold near Lake Biwa. When Yasuke arrived, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Nobunaga reportedly did not believe that Yasuke's skin was natural. He ordered him to undress from the waist up and wash himself, convinced that the color must be artificial. Only after seeing that it did not fade did Nobunaga accept what he was seeing. Rather than dismiss him, Nobunaga became fascinated. He questioned Yasuke directly, likely through interpreters. He asked where he was from, how he came to Japan, what lands he had seen. Nobunaga was known to enjoy novelty, but he was also a keen judge of people. Strength, presence, and composure mattered to him. Yasuke stood before one of Japan's most dangerous men, calm, silent, and unmoved. The encounter did not end with dismissal. Instead, it marked the beginning of something rare. From that moment forward, Yasuke ceased to be merely a traveling retainer. He entered the orbit of power. The crowd's curiosity gave way to a lord's attention, and history began to narrow its focus around him. For the first time, Yasuke was no longer passing through a place. He was being invited to stay. Life near Oda Nobunaga was never ordinary. Once Yasuke entered Nobunaga's service, the noise of the crowds faded, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous: proximity to power. Nobunaga was not a sentimental man. He was decisive, ruthless when needed, and deeply pragmatic. Those who remained close to him did so because they were useful, trusted, or intriguing enough to keep his attention. Yasuke became all three. Historical records indicate that Nobunaga took Yasuke into his personal household. This was not a symbolic gesture. Those allowed near a daimyo's living quarters were carefully chosen. Yasuke was given lodging, food, and likely a stipend, signs that he was no longer simply a foreign curiosity, but part of Nobunaga's inner world. At some point during this period, Yasuke was given a Japanese name, the one history remembers. The act of naming carried weight. Names tied individuals to identity, place, and hierarchy. To receive one was to be acknowledged as more than an outsider. Nobunaga also reportedly presented Yasuke with a short sword. In 16th century Japan, swords were not decorative objects. They were symbols of status, authority, and belonging. While the exact rank Yasuke held is debated, the act itself strongly suggests that he was recognized as a warrior retainer, what later generations would call a samurai, though terminology at the time was more fluid. Yasuke's role was likely multifaceted. He may have served as a personal attendant, bodyguard, or trusted presence during Nobunaga's daily routines. His physical strength alone would have been an asset. Accounts describe him as exceptionally strong, capable of feats that impressed even seasoned warriors. But strength was not enough. Nobunaga valued intelligence, discipline, and composure. Yasuke had already demonstrated these qualities simply by surviving displacement, cultural shock, and intense scrutiny without visible reaction. In a court filled with political tension and quiet rivalries, restraint mattered. Around him, Japan was still fractured. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, was defined by instability. Alliances shifted. Betrayal was common. Nobunaga himself had risen through violence and innovation, using firearms and unconventional tactics to crush rivals. Peace was fragile, temporary, and often deceptive. Yasuke lived inside this atmosphere. Days may have passed quietly, training, standing watch, listening to conversations he only partially understood. Nights likely carried the constant awareness that Nobunaga's enemies were never far away. Castles were not just residences, they were targets. And yet, for a brief moment, Yasuke had found something rare. He belonged somewhere, no longer a captive, no longer a nameless retainer following missionaries across oceans. He had a role, a name, and a place beside one of Japan's most powerful men. But power in this era was unstable by nature. The calm Yasuke experienced under Nobunaga's protection was not permanent. Events were already moving, quietly, invisibly, toward a moment that would end everything he had come to know. History was drawing closer. The morning of June 21st, 1582, began like many others. Kyoto was quiet. The air carried the warmth of early summer, and the city moved at its usual pace. Merchants opening stalls, monks tending temple grounds, soldiers standing watch where they had stood countless times before. Oda Nobunaga was resting at Honnoji, a Buddhist temple where he often stayed while traveling. It was not heavily fortified. Nobunaga believed the surrounding region to be secure. Most of his army was deployed elsewhere, preparing for campaigns that would expand his control even further. Yasuke was there with him. Exactly where Yasuke stood that morning is unknown. Records from this period are sparse and selective, but given Yasuke's role in Nobunaga's household, it is highly likely that he was nearby, within the temple grounds or close enough to respond when chaos arrived. And chaos arrived suddenly. Before dawn fully broke, the stillness shattered. Akechi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, turned his forces toward Honnoji. Instead of marching against a rival clan, Mitsuhide marched against his own lord. His troops surrounded the temple. Cries rang out. Gunfire echoed. Flames began to spread. Nobunaga's retainers rushed to defend the compound, but they were vastly outnumbered. Escape routes collapsed almost immediately. There would be no relief force, no second chance. Nobunaga understood the situation quickly. For a man who had spent decades navigating betrayal and violence, the meaning was clear. Capture would bring humiliation. Survival was unlikely. Resistance could only delay the inevitable. Inside the burning temple, Nobunaga chose death on his own terms. Historical accounts state that he committed seppuku, the ritual suicide reserved for warriors facing unavoidable defeat. The fire consumed the structure soon after, destroying his body and erasing much physical evidence of his final moments. The man who had nearly unified Japan was gone. Yasuke survived. Records confirm that he did not die at Honnoji. Instead, he fled the temple grounds during or after the attack and reached Nijo Castle, where Nobunaga's son, Oda Nobunaga, was making a final stand against Mitsuhide's forces. There, Yasuke fought again. When Nijo Castle fell, Nobunaga also chose ritual suicide. The Oda leadership was extinguished in a single day. The rebellion succeeded faster than anyone could have imagined. Yasuke was captured. This is where history speaks softly. Mitsuhide did not execute him. Instead, Contemporary accounts suggest that Yasuke was described as a beast or non-Japanese, and therefore not subject to the same codes of honor or punishment as a Japanese retainer. Rather than treating him as a samurai enemy, Mitsuhide reportedly ordered that Yasuke be handed back to the Jesuit missionaries. This decision spared Yasuke's life, but it also stripped him of everything he had gained: his name, his status, his place beside Nobunaga. All vanished overnight. From warrior to outsider once more, Yasuke was removed from the battlefield and returned to the margins of recorded history. The Sengoku world moved on quickly, swallowing Nobunaga's death and reshaping itself under new leaders. And Yasuke, the man who had stood at the center of power, quietly disappeared from view. What followed is uncertain. No records describe his final years. No grave is marked. No confirmed accounts tell us how or where he lived after that night. History simply lets him fade. Yet the silence itself tells a story. Yasuke had crossed oceans, cultures, and social boundaries few ever crossed in the 16th century. He had stood beside one of Japan's greatest figures and lived through the moment that ended an era. And then, like so many lives shaped by history's violence, he slipped back into anonymity. After the fall of Oda Nobunaga, the world Yasuke had known ceased to exist. The Sengoku period did not pause to mourn. Power shifted rapidly. Alliances broke and reformed. Armies marched again. New leaders rose where old ones had fallen. In this movement, there was little room for a foreign warrior whose protector was gone. Historical records fall silent. After Yasuke was handed back to the Jesuit missionaries, no confirmed documents record his actions, location, or fate. He does not appear in later military rosters. He is absent from land grants, temple records, and court chronicles. Unlike Japanese retainers, whose lives were meticulously documented through service and lineage, Yasuke left no bureaucratic footprint. This absence is not unusual for the time. Many individuals, especially foreigners, servants, and soldiers without family ties, vanished from the written record once their usefulness ended. History preserved the powerful. Others were allowed to drift away unnoticed. It is possible Yasuke remained with the Jesuits. Missionaries often relocated, frequently moving between ports such as Nagasaki, Hirado, or returning to trading enclaves connected to Portuguese ships. If Yasuke stayed with them, his life may have returned to something closer to his earliest years in Asia, laboring, assisting, observing, existing quietly on the edge of multiple cultures. It is also possible he remained in Japan. Some scholars suggest he may have lived out his days in obscurity, perhaps as a servant, laborer, or guard. Without Nobunaga's patronage, Yasuke would not have been recognized as a samurai by the new ruling powers. His unique position had always depended on a single man, and that man was gone. No account records his death. No age is given. No place is named. No ceremony marks his passing. And yet, his brief appearance left an impression that endured. Centuries later, when historians began re-examining Jesuit letters and Sengoku-era chronicles, Yasuke's name resurfaced, not as legend, but as fact. A black man, present in 16th century Japan. A retainer of Oda Nobunaga. A warrior who stood at the heart of political power during one of Japan's most violent eras. His legacy is not built on conquest. It rests on presence. Yasuke did not found a clan. He did not shape policy or command armies, but he crossed boundaries that most people of his time could not imagine crossing. He lived between continents, languages, and identities, African by origin, European by circumstance, Japanese by experience. In modern memory, Yasuke has become a symbol, To some, he represents cultural exchange. To others, survival. To many, possibility. Artists, writers, and storytellers have filled the silence left by history, imagining his inner life where records end. But beneath every retelling remains a quiet truth. Yasuke was real, and his life briefly intersected with the center of the world he entered. As time passed, Japan moved toward unification. The chaos of the Sengoku period faded into order. The temples were rebuilt. The names of generals were carved into stone. Yasuke's name remained lighter than that, a trace, a shadow, a figure who appeared, endured, and then stepped away. And perhaps that is fitting. Some lives change history loudly. Others do so simply by existing where history did not expect them. Yasuke belonged to the second kind. When Yasuke's name disappears from the written record, history does not end abruptly. It simply grows quiet. There are no final words attributed to him, no known grave, no confirmed account of where he lived afterward, or how long he lived at all. For centuries, Yasuke existed only as a brief presence inside other people's stories. A few lines in Jesuit letters, a handful of remarks in Japanese chronicles, a description of a man who stood out and then was no longer mentioned. This silence was not unusual. The Sengoku period produced endless records of battles, alliances, betrayals, and victories. But individuals without land, titles, or descendants were often left behind by history. Names faded once they stopped serving political or military purpose. Yasuke did not found a clan. He did not rule territory. He left no known heirs. And so the chronicles moved on. For generations, Japanese history focused on the great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Yasuke remained a detail within Nobunaga's story, not a story of his own. Outside Japan, he survived only in fragments. Jesuit letters described him as tall, dark-skinned, and strong. Foreign observers noted the curiosity he inspired, but even these accounts were brief, practical, and unconcerned with his inner life. Time passed. Wars ended. Japan entered long periods of peace. Borders closed. Records were copied, condensed, or lost. Yasuke became a quiet absence, not erased, but unexamined. It was not until much later, when historians began to look more closely at overlooked figures, that his name resurfaced. Modern scholars returned to the old texts and noticed him again. A man who did not fit neatly into expectations. A foreigner who had stood beside one of Japan's most powerful warlords. In the modern imagination, that absence became space. Writers, artists, and storytellers began to fill the silence. Some imagined Yasuke as a full samurai. Others emphasized his outsider status. Some portrayed him as a symbol of displacement, resilience, or cultural crossing. These interpretations say as much about the present as they do about the past. Historically, we know only fragments. Yasuke existed. He served Nobunaga. He was present at a turning point in Japanese history. Everything beyond that belongs to memory, imagination, and myth. And yet, even in silence, his presence lingers. Because history does not only preserve those who ruled. Sometimes it remembers those who stood briefly in the light and then stepped back into shadow. Yasuke remains there, not fully known, not entirely forgotten. A figure suspended between fact and imagination, between record and quiet. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of why his story still invites attention, because some lives are not meant to be resolved, only remembered softly as the night continues to settle. Yasuke's life does not close with certainty. There is no final battle to recount, no recorded farewell. Instead, his story fades the way many lives do, slowly, quietly, without announcement. Once, he walked through foreign lands. Once, he stood in the presence of power. Once, his existence surprised those who saw him. And then, history loosened its grip. What remains is not a legend carved in stone, but a human outline. A man who crossed oceans, cultures, and expectations, and for a brief moment stood fully within another world. Perhaps that is enough. Not every life needs a grand ending. Some lives matter because they existed at all, because they remind us that history is not only shaped by rulers and wars, but also by individuals who moved quietly through unfamiliar places, carrying their strength without spectacle. As the story settles, imagine the world growing still, lanterns dimming, footsteps fading into distance, a long road stretching into night, unanswered and unhurried. Yasuke's name rests there now, not demanding resolution, only remembrance. And with that, the story may finally rest. Thank you for listening to Boring Biography. Allow your thoughts to slow. Let the past drift gently away. There is nothing more to follow tonight. Good night. Sleep deeply, and may the quiet carry you safely into rest.